Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Todd Beach. This is our live stream for AP European History this morning. And next slide, please. Please, Katie.
Yep. Okay, so today we're going to talk about 20th century cultural and intellectual developments. We are going to talk about continuity and change in the age of global conflict. And then we're going to move on and Todd's going to contextualize the Cold War. So we've got a lot going on here. We're touching not only on Unit 8, but also moving to the end of Unit 9, because they kind of umbrella over each other and they all sort of go together.
And good morning. So again, my name is Todd Beach. I teach AP European History at Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. That's a suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we started our distance learning on this past week. Been in touch with my students. Hope they're doing well. And Katie.
Good morning. So I'm Katie Lancey. I teach at Coral Gables Senior High School, which is in Coral Gables. It's a suburb of Miami. It's hot and rainy here today, so I'm hoping my students aren't minding so much being inside watching this. I got to Zoom with them yesterday, got to see their beautiful faces. I miss them a lot. And I'll see you again tomorrow on Zoom.
Okay.
All right, so as we already talked about, we are going to explain how the first half of the 20th century really challenged things that are going on socially, different cultural developments, and as well as transforming intellectual understandings. We're going to talk about your amazing responses from yesterday. Again, we continue to be so impressed with the work that you're doing. Really, really great responses, and Todd's going to talk a little bit about those. And then he's going to talk about cultural and intellectual developments. We are not going in today to visual art. We're going to save that for another day. And then we'll talk about the beginnings of the Cold War and how the end of World War II really sets that up. As far as historical thinking skills, we're going to be doing skill 1, developments and processes, skill 2, sourcing and situation, and skill 4, contextualization. We'll also be doing the reasoning process of continuity and change over time.
Great, thank you, Katie. So for our warm-up, we gave you this exercise then as the homework for yesterday. This is sourcing and situation, and we've given you a primary source here. And before I dive into this, let's just understand, why sourcing is such an important skill. And I know that sourcing is a tested skill on the AP exam, but the big thing about sourcing is that it's really important for your everyday life. So we all happen to be living in an era where there is more information available to us than there has ever been before in history of time. And so we have information that's very accessible, but we also have misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, all those things flying at us at a time when it's really just a deluge, if you will, of information. And the thing about sourcing is that you learn then to understand what's being said by whom, why they might be saying what they're saying, what their motivation is, if they're a credible source to give that kind of information. So these skills of sourcing absolutely transfer to the adult lives, the student lives, the everyday life outside of the history classroom. So I just want to make sure I was really explicit with how important sourcing is. Okay. So we gave you this source from Alfred Rosenberg. He wrote in this text, The Myth of the 20th Century, and he wrote it in 1930. And we asked you to hap the source, to either identify the historical situation, the audience, the purpose, the point of view, and then always, when you are doing the hap part, you have to talk about why is that important? If I'm analyzing this, I also have to if we're looking at 2B there on the left, to explain why is that important, okay? And we got some great responses. Next slide, please, Katie. So this source came from Katie in Strathcona High School in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I figured you'd like her name. And this was her response, Katie's response for purpose. And the response begins, the purpose of the source being written was likely an attempt to increase popular support for the German army and nation. This would further foster ideals of nationalism and pride in one's country. The author urges for readers to understand the heroic nature inherent to Germans, a race of blood and honor. This was in hopes that the public would continue to support Germany going forward, or if it was their blood to do so. After a bitter defeat in World War I and subsequent loss of territory, country reparations and dwindling army as demanded by the Treaty of Versailles, many Germans were left feeling defeated. The presence of this message of German superiority is important to note, as Hitler and the Nazi Party would utilize this idea of heroic and honorable blood to add fire to the conquest for the ideals, the ideal world for the ideal people of pure Aryan blood. So really, really rich response there from Katie about the purpose of the source. Next slide, please. This is from Nick at Brainerd High School in my home state of Minnesota. And Nick writes, in the excerpts from Alfred Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, Mr. Rosenberg is speaking to interwar Germany in a time of great turbulence in politics and in the economy. During the rise of Hitler and fascism in Europe, he is speaking as a radical and a sociological theorist and as a leader in propaganda for the Nazi Party, a growing force in German politics and life. He is writing as someone of power and as someone we are not supposed to question, but rather accept. He writes the document to try and convince us, the readers. I want you to notice how we went from point of view now to audience here. He writes the document to try and convince us, the readers, to support the Nazi positions on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I and how the soldiers died in vain due to the current powers that be's actions. Rosenberg is speaking to a tired and depreciated Germany, one that is experiencing the Great Depression and one that is tired of the status quo and government that made peace and is looking for new ideas. These writing, as well as similar speeches and other propaganda, convinced the German public that Hitler was right and is the best choice for Germany, leading to his successful takeover of the German government in the Second World War. So really, really rich response for point of view and for audience from Nick in Brainerd. Next one, please. I really had a hard time because there were so many good responses. This is from Catalina at Dwight Englewood School in New Jersey. And Catalina actually had done all 4 of the HAPs. And what I did was just select one. It wasn't, and so Catalina, if you're listening, it wasn't because the others aren't any good. They are. I just wanted to focus on the point of view. So considering that Rosenberg was a major influential figure in Nazi Party, he was most likely an elite seeking to disseminate Nazi ideas through literature. Rosenberg himself was likely drawn to the Nazi Party because he experienced the horrors of World War I, or at the very least, the aftermath that left Germany at rock bottom. And the significance, this excerpt clearly shows the Nazi Party's strategies of appeal, reaching out to wounded morale and drawing in defeated citizens with the hope of a better future. The Nazi Party's powerful image attracted citizens in search for a strong leader, and propaganda such as Rosenberg's gave them something to relate to, as well as compelling call to action. Really, really well done on the student response, on Catalina's response here for point of view. Next slide, please. This is about purpose from Cam at DuPont Manual High School in Louisville. Rosenberg was a Nazi fanatic, so therefore he was involved in the awakening of the German desire for revenge for the First World War. He had to stir up ultra-nationalistic feelings that would make the German people feel as if their God-given duty to avenge the fallen. Rosenberg says demonic forces have triumphed over the godlike, therefore making the German people feel as if they were in the right and the Allies and the Jews were the bad guys on the global stage. Politically, the Nazis were rapidly gaining power in the Reichstag, and a shift in a German people's attitudes towards the Nazi agenda was the first step in a total takeover of Germany. Propaganda, I love that you just named it right there, Cam. Propaganda like this created a war machine unlike anything seen before, and the German mindset on the outbreak of war reflected this. The soldiers felt as if they were destined to win and avenge their forefathers. Really rich response.
Wow.
And I think we have one more. Yeah, this one's for audience, and this is from Arthur, who is a student at the American School of Marrakesh in Morocco. In the
Wow.
early 1930s, the Nazis became Germany's second national party, promising the German people, still shaken by the Treaty of Versailles, to restore their country's economy and greatness. In the proposed excerpt, Alfred Rosenberg, one of the leading Nazi thinkers, reminds an informed audience, able of relaying the German people destroyed by the war and the crisis of 1929, that they are mythical and must rise again, and emphasizes the central role of propaganda in Hitler's rise to power. And again, really, really rich response from Arthur. So there were many, many great responses. I just wanted to keep going, but we obviously can't do that. So really well done, everybody.
Awesome. Okay, before we move on, I just want to hopefully put kids' minds at ease that those were rich and really, really detailed, and that they don't have to be quite as long in order to get credit. So if you've been doing them and they're a little bit shorter and a little bit more simplistic, that doesn't mean that you're not doing it right. And I know that different teachers use different acronyms, so your particular teacher's acronym might be different. I know HIPPO is out there and different versions of that. So those were just awesome. And I read through some of them this morning, and I'm super impressed at the work that all of you have been doing in your classes. It's awesome. So one of those responses talked about the interwar years and called it a time of turmoil. And that's definitely accurate. So one of the things that we see, and this particular key concept kind of backs up back to the beginning of the 20th century and talks about philosophical and religious changes that are happening during this time. So up until this point, we have the Enlightenment and its sort of cornerstone of reason and progress, and its optimism has been the cornerstone of thought up until we get to the point of the 20th century. So we are going to see that that ideal of reason and progress is going to break down because of World War One. We're going to see the effects of World War One and the economic depression undermine that confidence that people had in science and human reason. And we're going to see philosophies that challenge reason and actually stop believing in reason. And the experience of World War One is going to confirm for people that people are violent and irrational. And that's only going to be furthered by the growth of violent fascist movements all throughout Europe. So if you look at our mustached gentleman on the right, that's Friedrich Nietzsche. And he predates the 20th century, but we're going to talk about how his ideas about and his philosophy really are going to further ideas that come out of the 20th century. So he definitely believed that rationality was overemphasized. He's very famous for his quote about God is dead. And from that, he's saying that he's rejecting religion, that he's rejecting a deity that gives meaning to humanity. And he believed that human existence was in fact meaningless. And so from this, we're going to have the growth of existentialism. And most existentialists are going to look at Nietzsche as sort of a inspiration. Most of them will also be atheists and again, reject the belief in a God. We're going to see that existentialism can unite diverse and contradictory thinkers as they're searching for morality in a world that is filled with anxiety. And that word is highlighted because this whole time period is called the Age of Anxiety. Some of your textbooks probably call the chapter where this is covered that. These existentialists believed that humans were alone and that there was no God to help them. So what we're really seeing is just the deep despair that comes out of World War I changing the human psyche is going to affect the way people move forward. So we have some influential examples, and on the right there we have Jean-Paul Sartre, and he is best known along with Albert Camus, who wrote The Stranger, for existentialism in the 20th century. And so while these existentialists are really going to reflect the anxiety of the 20th century, that doesn't mean that God doesn't have a place. And what we will see also is that even though there's this growing influence of existentialism, there is still a profound effect from organized religion and Christianity in European social and cultural life. So we're going to have at this time sort of a growth of Christianity, a revival of Christianity. We have this group of people known as the Christian existentialists. They're people who are still affected by this despair after World War I, and yet they're looking to God to help cope with that despair. We have Soren Kierkegaard, who he becomes the person who coins, it's a rough translation of a metaphor he's making, but that's where we get the phrase take a leap of faith to talk about his relationship to overcome religious doubts and have a relationship with God. And we'll see as we move forward, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about literature in a few minutes, that a lot of writers during this time have these conversion experiences or for the first time find religion. And some examples of that are Huxley, and you may have read in school Brave New World, or C.S. Lewis, who I think is most famous for his Chronicles of Narnia, which was a childhood favorite of mine. So the idea behind all of this is that people are searching for meaning. So whether the existentialists or the Christian existentialists are having a relationship with God or not, they're looking for meaning because the horrors of total war have really challenged and shaken their stability and their meaning in life. So
Thank you, Katie.
you're
We're
welcome.
going to talk about the new physics now. And again, we're talking in the context of intellectual developments of the 20th century. And so I was doing these yesterday, and I was kind of found myself going down a wormhole. See what I did there, Katie? As I was
saw that.
trying to figure out which pieces of the physics that I felt were going to be most relevant and important. And so we'll do a little bit here. There was this idea as we entered the 20th century that science, unlike religion and the philosophical speculation, was based on hard facts, controlled experiments. And an important first step of the new physics was the discovery that atoms are composed of many far smaller, fast-moving particles, electrons, protons. And one of our first physics, Polish-born physicist Marie Curie is who we're going to focus on right now. And her French husband, Pierre, discovered that radium constantly emits subatomic particles. This does not have a constant atomic weight. And she is going to develop the theory of radioactivity. And so you see the image of her on the right in her laboratory in Paris. She will win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, first woman to win a Nobel Prize. She will win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1911, first person to ever win a Nobel Prize twice. During World War I, she'll develop mobile radiography units to provide X-ray services to field hospitals during the war. She will become a professor at Paris University, first woman on faculty there. Unfortunately, she dies in 1934 because of all the exposure to radiation that she has had through the course of her work, through the radiological work in field hospitals during World War I. But her contributions are incredibly significant during this time. Next is Max Planck. He's shown here in Berlin in 1919. And his contributions have to be with the idea of quanta, these pieces of energy that he observes coming into question. And what the idea is, he sees quanta, and now we have this distinction between matter and energy. And he will win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1918 for his work in quantum theory and the development of quantum physics. He's a professor at Berlin University and a member of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. He was 74 in 1933 when the Nazis came to power in Germany. And he witnessed many of his Jewish friends and colleagues who were professors expelled from their positions and humiliated. And hundreds of scientists would emigrate away from Germany during this time. Interestingly enough, Planck's son, Erwin, was arrested in 1944 following the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on July 20th, and he was tried and sentenced to death in 1945. And then, of course, we have Albert Einstein. You're probably more familiar with him. Born in Germany, but moved to Switzerland at the age of 16, renounced his German citizenship and acquired Swiss citizenship, which he will keep throughout the rest of his life. He will earn his PhD from Zurich at the age of 26. In 1905, he will undermine what we've known as Newtonian physics with his theory of special relativity. And it postulates that time and space are relative to the viewpoint of the observer, and the only speed of light is constant for all frames of reference. So there are lots of YouTube videos if you want to look at Einstein and this idea of theory of relativity and time and space. There's the twins paradox that's also really interesting to look at. He will win the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921, and his theory will state that matter and energy are interchangeable, And his ideas unified an apparently infinite universe with the incredibly small, fast-moving subatomic world. Why this all matters is because we have these new developments in physics, which governments are later going to capitalize on. In 1933, when Einstein was visiting the United States, Hitler came to power. And because of Einstein's Jewish background, he would decide not to return to Germany. He'll eventually become a US citizen in 1940 and he'll accept a position at Princeton. And I think we have one more. Werner Heisenberg is a German physicist, and he was a key pioneer of quantum mechanics. And he's known for the uncertainty principle, which he published in 1927. He'll win the Nobel Prize in 1932. In 1942, and you see him here at this source on the right, the picture is, he's served at a number of universities, and this is when he was at the University of Copenhagen in 1925, is from the photograph. But in 1942, obviously the Nazis are in power, and he is told to report to Albert Speer, who is Germany's Minister of Armaments, on the prospects of research in developing nuclear weapons. During the meeting, it was reported that Heisenberg told Speer that a bomb could not be built before 1945 because the project is going to require significant money and significant personnel. And it's believed that after that meeting, then they kind of took a different direction and didn't necessarily pursue the bomb. It wasn't super clear, and the United States suspected, because a number of physicists in the United States, including Einstein, knew Heisenberg and knew of his work. And so the US suspected that Heisenberg was actually actively working to develop a nuclear weapon for Germany. They had sent an agent to a lecture that Heisenberg was giving in Switzerland, and the agent's name was Mo Berg. And the agent had orders to shoot and kill Heisenberg if the lecture indicated that Germany was close to completing an atomic bomb. Just that information alone gives you some context of how serious the nature of this work was when we've got governments involved in these kind of plans here. Heisenberg will be captured on May 3rd, 1945. Germany is going to surrender World War II May 7th. And Heisenberg and other prominent German scientists were held and interrogated by Britain's MI6 in England for 8 months before being allowed to return to their families. And some of the interrogation and the records of that were only just released in 1992 about what they learned from Heisenberg and others. So this activity is just contextualization. And we were talking yesterday, or Katie mentioned yesterday, about the dropping of the atomic weapon that ended the war in Japan on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that took place in, much later in the war, toward the end of the war in 1945. But this source was written by Albert Einstein in a letter he wrote to Franklin President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on August 2nd of 1939. And keep in mind, the United States didn't enter the war until 1941. This is just page 1 of the letter. The letter is easily Googleable, and you can look it up and see the second page if you wish. But Einstein writes to Roosevelt, "Sir, some recent work by E. Fermi and L. Szilard, which had been communicated to me in manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. Certain aspects of the situation which have arisen seem to call for watchfulness and, if necessary, quick action on the part of the administration. I believe, therefore, it is my duty to bring to your attention the following facts and recommendations. In the course of the last 4 months, it has been made probable, through the work of Joliot in France, as well as Fermi and Szilard in America, that it may be possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. Now it appears that almost certain that this could be achieved in the immediate future. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, but much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. However, such bombs might very well prove to be too heavy for transportation by air." So if you were to do this as a contextualization exercise, how could you explain this letter in the context of World War II and in the context that sets up what we're going to be talking about for the Cold War? Next slide, Katie.
So I ended that last little bit talking about C.S. Lewis and Huxley. And so literature and music also get really profound changes that are tied into that same philosophical changes I was talking about, changes that have to do with a sense of hopelessness and a sense of absurdity. And so the soldiers that are fighting, they come home as a generation themselves that's filled with hopelessness. We also have a group of writers, intellects, philosophers that are collectively known as the lost generation. They are characterized by a deep intellectual pessimism. They're alienated, and these themes come out quite a bit in their work. Many of them are American, but they'll end up being expats that live in Europe during different parts of their lives. And we end up also with the rise of modernism. And we're definitely not going to get into everything about modernism today, including the art, but we will talk a little bit about the writing. And I know my students all read The Metamorphosis by Kafka, and writers like him are trying to demonstrate the themes in their books about the world being unable to be controlled and understood. They're demonstrating an incomprehensible world characterized by a lack of control over events. And this highlights that same decline of reason that we see in philosophy at the time. We have novels like All Quiet on the Western Front that talks about how war rips away young people's innocence, it takes away hope. And we're going to see also modernist literature that will start to use our interior dialogues and monologues as a stream of consciousness. And we're going to see that appear in a lot of different writing. So an example of this would be Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway. She has this inner monologue that reveals the characters' worlds, but she has sort of a feminist take on this. Woolf herself believed really strongly that a woman needed to be able to make her own money, and that financial security would allow her to liberate herself from traditional female roles of wife and mother. And we'll talk a little bit also about the transformation of women's roles during this time also. James Joyce's very famous Ulysses is also sort of an inner monologue, and he's telling the story of one day of ordinary people in Dublin. And so we definitely see this sort of disconnection by getting into people's heads through this stream of consciousness. Music also during this time is going to parallel sort of the sort of experimentation that comes from this modern era. And a couple of examples of this are Stravinsky's Rites of Spring, as well as Schoenberg's. He starts something called atonal music, and it actually gets really rejected when he first comes out with it. And we will see that some of this modern music will be accepted, but not until after World War II. In the interwar years, a lot of this is sort of pushed back with. And so I've already talked a little bit about this last week, but it's important to understand that women are really transformed by this time period that starts in World War I. We will get all the way next week through the second wave of feminism. But starting with World War I, we have changing roles of women because total war. Total war is that war that is not just the people who are fighting in the front, but that the governments are utilizing every member of society. It's touching everyone's lives. We talked last week about things like rationing and war bonds. And so again, we'll mention that conscription meant that millions of men are going to the front to fight, which is going to leave this vacuum for women. Women are going to move into skilled industrial jobs, and they're going to work not just in munitions factories. And you might remember I showed you that picture of a British munitions factory with women manning it, but they're going to do other things like farm labor and police and firefighters. And like World War I that I mentioned, we will see women demobilize after World War II. The men that are returning from war want their jobs back, and we'll see kind of what happens because of that. In many countries, Britain, Germany, Poland, and the United States, most women are going to get legal suffrage, and they're going to get the right to vote because of their efforts in World War I. We also see the interwar years start to set up things, breaking sexual norms and breaking barriers for women's behavior. And we'll see this kind of culminate in that second wave of feminism we're going to talk about next week. The welfare state that a lot of these countries are going to create will create more jobs that we sort of talk about as stereotypical women's work. nurses and midwives and housekeepers and clerical jobs. But of course, they're not valued the way jobs are for men. We're going to see women receive lower wages, and women's jobs are not really taken into consideration as wages that are central to supporting their family. So that will also be part of this second wave that we'll talk about next week. And you can see sort of the British World War II propaganda poster that's on the right, and it's showing women mirrored sort of by their male counterparts that are away, which I kind of like that image.
Okay, so we've been trying to do this 20th century, these cultural, intellectual, and artistic developments, and now we're going to shift and talk about contextualizing the Cold War and contemporary war Europe after World War II. It's going to set up our conversations for tomorrow. So we have this map from the map archive. This is what Europe looked like in September of 1944. I struggled really to find a good resource. There's a lot of very busy maps, and I wanted something quite simple. So if you see kind of the salmon colored, the pinkish color, that's where the Allies are. In the greenish areas then are the Axis powers, or what Germany still controls by September of 1944. So they've had the D-Day invasion. They have made their way into France. They have liberated Paris. They're working, the US and the British troops are working from left to right on that map. And then obviously the Soviet troops are working from right to left, putting the squeeze, if you will, on Germany. And the idea was that they are going to, kind of meet in Berlin. So the United States, the USSR, Britain, they try to get together and shape a reasonable, lasting peace. The tide of the war is turned. The war's not over, but it's turned. The Americans and the British have avoided discussion of post-war aims and the shape of the eventual peace settlement until Tehran in 1943, when they moved, they have this discussion in Tehran, and they discuss that these ideas of what it's going to look like can no longer be postponed. Stalin, very concerned, this again, 1943, that the Soviet Union is bearing all the brunt of fighting in Europe, and asked the Allies to relieve his armies by opening a second front in France. And Roosevelt will consent. Churchill did not want to do this. Roosevelt will consent to a delayed American and British invasion of France, and it would mean that the Soviet and American British armies would come together in defeated Germany along kind of a north-south line, and that Soviet troops would play the predominant role in pushing the Germans out of the east and central, as you can see on the map, and British and American forces would be from the west, coming from the west. Next slide, please. The Allies are going to again meet in Yalta in February of 1945, and that each of the four victorious powers would occupy a separate zone of Germany, and that the Germans would pay reparations to the Soviet Union. And so the four victorious powers, obviously there's the three there pictured, but it would also be France would be very involved. And then for the B paragraph, at the post-war Potsdam Conference of July of 1945, the differences over elections in Soviet-occupied Europe surged to the fore when Roosevelt's successor, Truman, so Roosevelt has died, Harry Truman was vice president, becomes the president, and Harry Truman's in office, and so they're negotiating with somebody different, and he demands that free elections be held throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and Stalin just refuses point blank. Stalin, who had lived through two enormously destructive German invasions, was determined to establish a buffer zone of sympathetic states around the Soviet Union and at the same time expand the reach of communism and the Soviet state. So we have ideologies in conflict here. You've got Truman and free elections and liberal democracy, and you have Stalin, who has, in both world wars, the Soviets have suffered, or the Russians have suffered more losses than anyone else. And in both of those world wars, Germany has been the aggressor. And so in his mind, he's like, no, we're not going to have free elections. I'm not going to go do this again. And we're going to set up Soviet states. So Soviet armies in Central and Eastern Europe, there's no way short of the US or Britain to control the region's political future, and war is out of the question. And so these two composed or opposing ideologies have to actually try to get together and finish off the war. but you can see how the Cold War is already beginning before the war is completely over. Next slide, please. After Japan's surrender in September of 1945, Truman cut off all aid to the Soviet Union, who was in need of the aid. In October, he declares the United States will never recognize any government established by force or against the free will of its people. So because he believes that there aren't going to be free elections, Truman is saying we're not going to recognize any of those countries. March 1946, former British Prime Minister Churchill, the Labour Party comes to power in Great Britain, and now Churchill is no longer the prime minister, but he's visiting America, and he will inform an American audience at Westminster College in Missouri, and he'll give the Iron Curtain speech, that an Iron Curtain has fallen across the continent, dividing Europe into these two antagonistic camps. And so this map we see here, we kind of see this divide between East and West. You can also see the different zones of occupation. There's an American zone, a French zone, a German zone of occupation on the Western side. And this is kind of establishing this Cold War. Communists quickly realized they could not take power in free elections, and so they purge non-communists from the coalition governments that were set up after the war, and they established Soviet-style one-party communist dictatorships, which many would characterize as puppet states of the Soviet Union. And in early 1947, it appeared to many Americans that the Soviet Union was determined to export communism by subversion around the world. The United States will respond with the Truman Doctrine, aimed at containing communism to areas already under communist governments. And then E, the American determination to enforce containment became a lot more difficult when the Soviets exploded their own atomic weapon in 1945.
Okay, so, and of course, we are going to get into what happens because of this two-sided world that gets created at the end of World War II tomorrow, and move on a little bit into Monday. So for today, we definitely went over the events of the first half of the 20th century and how they challenged cultural and intellectual understandings. Todd went over the discussion of yesterday's lesson, and we have this discussion of developments, and we will move on to the actual visual art developments later in the week, and a discussion of the beginning of the Cold War. We went over the skills for developments and processes, for sourcing and situation, and for contextualization, as well as talking about continuity and change. So speaking about continuity and change, I'm going to come back to something similar to what we did last week with the long essay question. And I wanted to talk about the skills that go along with the long essay question and talk about today continuity and change over time. You guys did such a great job doing contextualization and thesis. I think that writing a thesis is definitely something we can practice over and over again. I know we're all waiting for Friday to see what form the exam is going to take, but even if there isn't a thesis on it, which would surprise me, we will definitely have this idea that you need to be able to make arguments in your writing throughout many different classes in high school and certainly throughout your university careers. So that's something we're going to practice today. So we have, if you look at the bottom of the slide, the prompt, evaluate the extent to which World War I transformed European thought and culture. And we talked about some of those things today. It was not in any way exhaustive of the things that you can include. But what I'd like you to do for today is practice your thesis writing and write a thesis claim in a paragraph that will include your line of reasoning statement. But then I want you to go beyond that, and let's talk about continuity and change. So this is one of the historical thinking skills that I think students have the most angst over. But if you think about World War I as sort of a turning point for intellectual thought and culture, and think about the evidence that you would use to support an argument, and you can certainly argue things that do not change, but I tend to think that students like to take the position that this is a transformative event, and to think about the evidence that you would use to demonstrate how it changed, and to be mindful of the fact that we're looking at continuity and change over time as a skill that you will use to frame an argument. So I want you to think about what existed before World War I, and you're going to talk about that in your evidence, and then you're going to bring it forward and explain how what evidence you might use is different. So I'm not actually asking you for today to write an entire long essay question, but perhaps you could write your thesis statement and give us a couple of bullets of evidence that you might use if you were writing this long essay question. We might practice some full long essay questions as we get closer to the exam. But for today, just think about your thesis, making sure that you have a line of reasoning that is historically defensible. And then I want you to really think about your evidence and how that relates to the skill of that word in the prompt transformed. So you can, as you have been, submit your responses to the email that's below, apeuro@gmail.com. And we have really, really enjoyed reading your responses. We've been so impressed at this community of scholars that's out there. You've been pretty awesome. So thank you.
This is a message from College Board about device and internet access. We know that not all students have access to the internet or a device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, you can reach out directly to College Board at cb.org/tech.
Okay. Well, thank you
All
guys
right.
so much. Hello.
Katie, it's good to see you.
Well, hold on. There we go. Now you can see me.
There you are. Hey, I'm going to let you in on a secret. It got to 60 degrees here in Minneapolis yesterday.
Wow.
But we were quiet about that, because it's Minnesota and it's spring and Mother Nature has a sense of humor. So we want to make sure that we're gracious.
The rain that we're having today is a cold front.
Okay.
So we're going to have a high of 78 tomorrow.
Okay.
So,
we won't see that for a while here.
I know. I'm sorry. And we won't see 60 for a while. We'll get in the 60s at night, but we won't get all the way down to 60 probably until well into next fall. Wow. So we're living in different worlds, my friend.
For sure.
All right.
Hey,
anyway.
Thank you everybody for watching. Shout out to our producer, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for all your work.
Always. Always. She's wonderful.
We'll
Take
see
care.
you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.